Now that the holiday season is essentially a distant memory and people are safely ensconced in their own homes far away from those relatives you only see once or maybe twice a year, it's safe to discuss a bit of a thorny topic. It's one of those conversations that can cause a little bit of friction over the dinner table. There are some folks out there, some who watch this channel and many who do not, that disagree with the scientific consensus that 1, the planet is warming, and 2, that the warming is a bad thing, and 3, that humans and largely our use of fossil fuels are the cause. So today we're going to talk about why some folks believe that climate change is not a thing that's happening, and maybe why they should believe what the oil companies have to say. As far back as 1856, there's been some question about the impact of carbon dioxide on the climate. The scientist Eunice Foote is credited with being the first person to identify that carbonic acid gas, which would later be known as carbon dioxide, could produce a heat-trapping effect. And her paper? Well, I'll quote it, because it's remarkably direct.
An atmosphere of that gas would give our Earth high temperature, and if, as some suppose, at one period of its history the air had mixed with it a larger proportion than at present, an increased temperature from its own action as well as from increased weight must have necessarily resulted.
A few years later, in 1861, the results were confirmed by John Tyndall, who indicated that shifts in water vapour or carbon dioxide could produce a change in the climate. And by 1896, Svante Arrhenius, a Swedish scientist, suggested that temperatures would rise significantly with a rise in carbon dioxide level. So one would think that by 2023 there would have been enough experiments done that we would be at a point where there simply wouldn't be debate about whether carbon dioxide and its release by humans was impactful. And interestingly, back in the 1970s and 80s there wasn't a huge amount of debate. But then things started to change, at least for the public. For mainstream scientists, there's been a debate about exactly how much of an impact and the fine details of how significant the consequent changes from carbon dioxide release might be. But it's fairly much settled science. Typically, modelling puts us on course for a rise of just shy of 3 degrees Celsius, which doesn't sound like much, but if it's right and we don't do something now to avoid it, that's absolutely catastrophic. But if scientists aren't having that debate, then where did the public debate come from? Well, the first point of call in our journey to finding out how that uncertainty appeared was really in 1959, almost 100 years from that first warning. Edward Teller, a scientist who'd worked on the atomic bombs, told a symposium organised by the American Petroleum Institute, which was being attended by a mixture of government and policy folks, as well as senior members from a variety of oil companies, that the product that they were selling would bring about risks greater than an atomic bomb. He told them that the carbon dioxide being released from burning fossil fuels would, quote, be sufficient to melt the ice cap and submerge New York. But he didn't stop there. He went on to say, quote, all the coastal cities would be covered, and since a considerable percentage of the human race lives in coastal regions, I think that this chemical contamination is more serious than most people tend to believe, end quote. Then he went on to talk about nuclear power, which I'm sure went over very well with a large group of fossil fuel executives. Executives who I think were much happier to listen to their corporate musical. And now, on Music from the Colonies, we have an excerpt from the Exxon musical, Spirit of Achievement. Yeah, so they did that. Unfortunately for those executives, the US government's representatives clearly heard what he had to say, and just 6 years later, a report issued by President Johnson announced that carbon dioxide was an invisible pollutant that would lead to the melting of the polar ice caps, a statement that was also reiterated to Congress in one of President Johnson's speeches. But just as this was happening, US and Canadian oil companies were beginning to realise just how much oil was stored in the Alberta tar sands. And while that oil might be more difficult, more dirty, and more expensive to extract than, say, oil from the Middle East, it was also something that they could do without stepping outside the bounds of North America. It was a domestic fuel that could be portrayed as providing stability and avoiding those nasty foreign imports of oil. And particularly for certain companies that invested heavily in the very few North American facilities that could refine that sandy, tarry, sticky mess into oil, it was a huge boost to their potential future bottom line, because very few companies could process it. Anyone for a quick game of Monopoly, folks? What to do? Well, unlike the oil companies' unsuccessful attempts to block smog legislation, which had largely relied on the rather optimistically named Smoke and Fumes Committee, a committee that railed against successful pollution controls that had rapidly reduced smog and acid rain, publishing, and I use this term quite loosely, research and papers that claimed that pollution controls were unnecessary because the cause of acid rain wasn't known. And it did that for years after not only was the hypothesized link between sulfur dioxide and acid rain clear, but the restrictions that had massively reduced it had been in place and been shown to be effective. That clearly wasn't going to cut it for this whole carbon dioxide problem. So instead, the fossil fuel majors decided to learn absolutely everything that they could about it. They employed scientists and spent a lot of time and effort modelling various scenarios, and they explained the uncertainties that they found. Well, okay, that's not strictly true. Their executives publicly explained their own personal alleged uncertainties. The scientists were pretty unequivocal. One of Shell's earlier forays into funding climate research, a 1981 University of East Anglia study, resulted in its author, Dr. Wigley, informing Shell that there had already been a 0.5 degree temperature increase, that it was caused by carbon dioxide, and that over the next 40 years we'd see a further 1 to 2 degrees of warming. And that is clearly wrong. I mean, I've been alive 40 years and... Oh wait, no. Apparently that's pretty close. Apparently 2023 is predicted to be approximately 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer than before humans started burning stuff for fun and profit, and just under a degree warmer than when that study was done. Wait, no. Nikki's got an updated newsflash. It's climate experts now say that we're heading for an El Nino weather pattern in 2023 and 2024. That could result in unprecedented extreme weather events, and we'll be in excess of the magic 1.5 degrees Celsius limit we need to keep anthropogenic climate change under control and the planet mostly habitable. Rats. Oh well, anyway, that's just really one data point. It doesn't exactly mean anything, does it? Let's move on. So, despite the fact that Dr. Wigley gave them an answer that wasn't exactly what they were hoping for, they were pleased by the other bits of his report, which indicated that he didn't believe that the science was settled enough to force government action. Still, in the 1980s, Shell leapt into action to clean up their fuel.
Last year, Shell introduced the first new petrol for 15 years. It's still the only petrol to have a sparkader with a detergent. However, not everyone has heard.
Oh, they put detergent in it. Detergent. I mean, I guess that's cleaner. I suppose. That's not quite what I was hoping that they did. Okay. Unfortunately for Shell and the other oil companies, by 1988, the science had reached a state of crystal clarity. Shell's own modelling indicated that carbon dioxide could make significant changes in sea level, ocean currents, precipitation patterns, regional temperatures, and weather. Changes larger than had been seen in the last 12,000 years. Changes that would mean that large, low-lying areas like Bangladesh might have to be abandoned completely, and that could force the 30% of the world's population that lived at the time within a 50-kilometre, about 30-mile area adjoining the world's oceans to need to relocate. Indeed, their own report said that their products would, quote, have a substantial impact on global habitability. And in 1988, James Hansen, a NASA scientist, went before the Senate and explained that climate change had arrived, that the multi-year drought the US was experiencing was, at least in part, likely caused by climate change, and that those things were going to get worse. And oil companies knew they were in trouble because despite massive vested interests and their deep pockets, politicians were starting to act.
Gases we're releasing today into the atmosphere will be with us for generations to come, for centuries, some of them. And what we do today will directly affect the lives of our children and our grandchildren and their grandchildren. And we can't sit around waiting for homes to be flooded, harbors destroyed, crops to wither and die before we take definitive action.
So in 1989, the Global Climate Coalition was formed. Doesn't that sound nice and heartwarming, like a cuddly group that's doing its level best to protect the environment? Let's look at its members. General Motors, Chrysler, Ford, Shell, Suncor, and Imperial Oil. Oh, and the American Petroleum Institute. Well, given that they've known internally since 1959, at least since 1959, that fossil fuels cause a release of carbon dioxide, and we know Shell and the other large oil companies, and probably given people shift between them, the small ones too, knew about carbon dioxide's impact on the environment, we can presume that they spread the very best and most up-to-date information about their research. Only, of course, they didn't. Instead, it published Climate Watch Bulletin, which stated fun things like, quote, "No, but it does point out the fact that the science of climate change continues to be uncertain. The data and interpretations of that data change almost daily." Which is particularly odd because its own in-house scientific primer stated that alternate theories, quote, "do not offer convincing arguments against the conventional model of greenhouse gas emissions-induced climate change." And the hits kept on coming because in 1991 a study by Imperial Oil demonstrated that one policy that was pretty popular in a fairly decisive move could massively reduce fossil fuel consumption without causing catastrophic economic consequences. Like Shell and Exxon, Imperial Oil's internal research was very clear. Climate change was linked to fossil fuels, although that definitely wasn't the line that they took publicly. And cap and trade, which was a solution that both Republicans and Democrats could largely agree on in the US, had also gained a foothold with the Conservative government in Canada. Worse, their research said it would be effective. Its own research showed that in 1991, a price of $55 for each tonne of carbon dioxide emitted would result in Canadian provinces closing down oil refineries, rail companies moving away from diesel locomotives, utilities building more hydro and nuclear power, and money from the revenue generated would pour into clean energy programs. And the biggest problem? Well, remember how the Smoke and Fumes Committee and a bunch of utilities had banded together to try and block the restrictions on sulfur dioxide? Yeah, now research also said that rather than costing money, that legislation had actually produced an estimated $119 billion of net benefits. But those benefits definitely didn't come to the oil companies, and so cap and trade, or really any fossil fuel restrictions, couldn't be allowed to happen. So Imperial Oil, just as with the other oil majors, kept funneling their efforts into disinformation. Something that was vitally important because in 1995 in Kyoto there was a slim chance that we might have actually done something significant to act on this research. The research that the oil companies' internal documents kept reinforcing while they undermined it publicly. Exxon's subsidiary Imperial Oil publicised a study on carbon taxation which ignored any benefits to companies outside the fossil fuel industry and focused solely on the impact regulations would have on the fossil fuel industry. And so went the fossil fuel companies' multi-pronged attack. Part 1 was mobilizing the disinformation movement, utilizing groups like Informed Citizens for the Environment, a utility-led campaign. The aim there was to reposition climate change as a theory and undermine the clear scientific consensus that existed even within the oil companies' own scientific leads. Second was in part funded by Koch Industries' pet think tank, the Cato Institute, and other similar organisations. Star non-climate specialist scientists like Dr. Patrick Michaels, who later became a, quote, climatologist, worked to seed doubt about the consensus on climate change. Popping up in interview after interview and writing editorials for national and local papers, Michaels and other similar players encouraged their fans to tell their friends and family about the uncertainty that they claimed existed, leveraging the personal networks of everyone who saw their lies on TV or in the papers. Just as the cigarette companies paid advertising firms big bucks to try and convince consumers that somehow there wasn't scientific consensus on the effects smoking had on the human body, so too did oil companies do the same. The problem is, when you're one of the richest industries on the planet, you can afford to pay the very best silver-tongued devils to make things look all cozy and safe.
People want to be told what to do so badly that they'll listen to anyone.
So as the Kyoto Agreement approached, oil companies stepped it up to magnify and exploit the differences in which countries should take the lead on tackling climate change. The consensus had been that countries that had gained the most from carbon dioxide release would be the ones to do the most. By the time Kyoto had rolled around, consensus had been destroyed, and the public understanding of climate change was vastly lower than it had been in the 80s. That is thanks to the work of oil companies. And look, I could go on. We know that the same companies worked on preventing fossil fuel regulations as worked for cigarette companies, as they tried to block the restrictions on sales of nicotine products. We know that whenever the risk has been too great to lie, oil companies have admitted that they know. In 1997, John Brown at Stanford, the chairman of BP, said,
"A year ago, the second report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was published. That report, and the discussion which has continued since its publication, shows that there is mounting concern about two stark facts. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is rising, and the temperature of the Earth's surface is increasing. But there is now an effective consensus amongst the world's leading scientists and serious and well-informed people outside the scientific community that there is a discernible human influence on the climate and a link between the concentration of carbon dioxide and the increase in temperature."
And he may have felt that way, but in that same speech he managed to seed doubt. He managed to underrepresent the extent of the risk, despite having some of the best funded scientists in his own company providing research that said that the threat is more dire than the potentially 15 to 95 centimetres, that's about 3 foot of sea level rise, that he indicated. So fossil fuel companies keep funding climate change denial. The Fraser Institute, a Canadian libertarian think tank just a couple of 100 miles from me, which receives massive donations from fossil fuel corporations, said in 2007, "Consequently, there will remain an unavoidable element of uncertainty as to the extent that humans are contributing to future climate change, and indeed whether or not such change is a good or bad thing." So while they have started to, at least in some cases, admit that perhaps climate change is an issue and try to shift their businesses to take advantage of the money that is available to fight climate change, they still continue to fund organisations that undermine that message. And they still do things that are patently ridiculous, like, for example, Ohio's Republican Governor Mike DeWine signing a bill in January this year that redefines fossil fuel methane gas as green. No, I'm not joking. The bill was in part lobbied for by the Empowerment Alliance, led by a manufacturer of natural gas compressors, and snuck through in possibly the weirdest amendment to a poultry purchasing bill that we've seen for a while. We continue to see astroturf groups. Those are groups that look or sound like grassroots organisations but are instead funded by oil, gas and other large corporations using the same techniques that we've seen for decades, manipulating graphs, providing misleading and inaccurate information, or we've seen the effect of Brandolini's law in action, where it takes vastly more effort to disprove a lie than it does to spread that lie. And research has demonstrated that disinformation often has a deeper and wider reach than the truth because it plays to people's own biases. So despite the fact that oil companies' modelling was really good, and is probably stunningly good now, and when I say really good, look at these graphs. Don't you love a good graph? The blue line here shows the actual measured carbon dioxide concentration. The red line, temperature change, and these predictions are from 30 years ago. That's pretty darn impressive. So as oil companies take ill-gotten gains and buy up charging suppliers whose massive early investment in an expensive new technology has left them ripe for picking up on the cheap, and as we see oil companies try to somewhat pivot but try and keep extracting and selling as much oil as they can just to see how close to the precipice of climate disaster they can get us, remember,
the time to consider the policy dimensions of climate change is not when the link between greenhouse gases and climate change is conclusively proven, but when the possibility cannot be discounted and is taken seriously by the society of which we're part. We in BP have reached that point.
The reason your friend or your colleague believes climate change is a hoax is that oil companies lied. They lied and they paid to spread information they knew would be false. They worked out the very best and most effective ways to get those lies to spread, and they're still doing it now. And on that note, we're done with today's video. If you liked it, you know what to do, and feel free to tip us with a super thanks. The comments are open for your thoughts, as is our Discord chat room. Links below. If you want more, subscribe, hit the bell, and follow the links below to regularly support us with a YouTube membership or a Patreon subscription. You'll also find links to our Ko-fi, Bitcoin and Swag store. And check us out on Mastodon. We have our very own server. We're just that cool. Scrolling by, on my right is our list of amazing charged up supporters, and shoutouts go to our self-driving tier supporters Mike Weeder, Linda Irish, Sean Tucker, Patrick Boyarski, Paul Nelson, Chris Maxwell, Brian Newton, Michael Goad, Bennett Elder, Andrew Martin, Pedro Mura Pinheiro, Brophy Wolf, Chris and Michael Johnson, Tesla in the Gong, Dan Blair, Peter Dillinger, Gordon C., Stephen O'Donoghue, Kyle Hodgson, Anthony Coates, Raging Fellows, Denny Hyde, Krista Center, and Jim Burness. Finally, out of this world, thanks to our Starman supporters Andrew Glenn, Anonymous Freak, JP Fagerback, Joe Bresney, John Lyons, Rory Litwin, Kevin Burrowbridge, Dave Kitchen, Aaron Han, Laura Reynolds, Marcel Ward, Matthew Drobnak, Paul Conway, Reggie Watts, Will Graylan, and Ian. And actually, special thanks to everyone who's joined us in the last few days. I know your names aren't on here. I'm really sorry. They'll be in the next one, I promise. We'll be back soon with more videos, but until then, keep evolving.